Your style sheets are bloated and making a mess. Your HTML is ashamed of your CSS. It's not organized and it's not classy. It's time to make your style sheets sassy. Using CSS extensions are the preference. We'll use mixins, nesting, and inheritance. Functions extend and partials will amass. In no time you'll be assembling sass.
Welcome to Level 2 of Assembling Sass, Variable. In Level 2, we'll be discussing how to set and use variables, the types of variables we can set, scoping variables, and interpolation. So eventually the CSS spec will natively support variables, but for now, Sass affords us a way to use these bits of recallable information. In Sass, we define a variable with a $sign followed by the name. So here you can see we're defining a base variable and giving it a color value. So then within our Sass code, we can call base by just using the name and any value, and that color code that we gave it initially will be inserted when we compile to our CSS file. Optionally, we can use the default flag when we define variables. Normally, if we define a variable, then call it again to define a new value, that first value is overwritten. In this case, using title and then defining title again immediately thereafter changes that value to the second value, so when we use it and when it compiles, that second value is the value that's used. When we use the default flag, however, on that second variable definition, it checks to see first whether or not a value already exists. So in this case, since my blog is already set to title, the second value of about me doesn't override my blog. Let's take a look at how this might be useful. If we're defining more modular Sass, like a buttons partial here that we'll be importing into application later, if we want this partial to be hands-off, to have a bunch of code that we're not going to touch later, we might define a rounded variable with the default flag so that we can override it if we want, but if nothing else is provided in the file that it will be imported into, then it will go ahead and set itself based on a value not being set. So back in our application.scss file, we can go ahead and set a rounded variable. We can import buttons, and since we're overriding that default, it will go ahead and use that new value when it compiles down to CSS. There are a number of different types of values we can store as variables, including booleans like true and false, numbers with or without units, colors, including just straight name colors like purple, RGBA values, and hex values, strings with or without quotes, lists, which kind of act like arrays, either they're comma separated or have spaces, and null, which we'll go into later as far as conditionals. Alright, we're about halfway through variables. Let's talk a bit about scoping variables. Here we're able to define variables within a CSS declaration. We're defining our border color within the paragraph declaration, then using it. However, if we try to use that variable in our H1 declaration, it doesn't have access to that initial border variable, and when we compile down, it's going to throw an error. So any variables that we set within a declaration aren't available outside the declaration. However, if we define a variable outside of a declaration and change it within a declaration, it changes that variable globally. Let's take a look at an example of that. First up, we'll define a color base with a color value, and then within our sidebar declaration, we're going to change that value and use it. When that compiles, we can see that our changed value is what's used for that sidebar background color. Later, however, when we try to reuse that variable in a different declaration like paragraph here, that changed value is going to be used as well. Changing it within a declaration changed it globally. So last up as far as variables go is interpolation. Now we can use the Ruby-esque method of using a hash followed by an opening and closing curly brace to add our variables to either selector names, property names, or then strings. Here we're setting a variable to the string of top, and then if we wanted to use that as a property inside of our super declaration, we can go ahead and interpolate the value of our side variable as the property within there. When this compiles down, since side is equal to the string of top, that string is inserted into that interpolation, and that's the property that's used in that second position within super. Also, we're able to interpolate this value of the side variable into a selector. So second here, we have a callout hyphen and interpolated value of side. When this compiles down, we can see it compiles to callout hyphen top, with top being the value of our side variable. We find it useful to be very considerate in naming our variables. If we use things that are more semantic, like color base, we get a lot more mileage out of it than something like color blue as we move sass from project to project. Alright, so that wraps up level 2. Good luck with the challenges, and we'll see you in level 3.